So starting from where we left off last time, we talked about the shift in imperial regimes from the relatively strong regime run by the adult, successful emperor Theodosius to the regimes of his sons, Honorius and Arcadius, two figures who had accomplished very little other than being born to the previous reigning emperor. And what we see is a shift in the way Roman imperial power is expressed and understood by those who support Honorius and Arcadius. So, for example, this coin of Arcadius shows the rationale for Arcadius's power, illustrated by the crowning or the hand of God bringing a crown down upon Arcadius, symbolizing that his power comes from his piety and from his connection to God, less than his connection and his achievements as a military leader. Now, ultimately, in practice, what we see is these weak emperors have a series of competing interests that develop around them, competing interests that will come to dominate the sorts of directions of imperial policy. But these competing interests compete with each other, and so there is no clear, overwhelming, and unquestioned authority who is dictating how the emperor will behave. Sometimes the imperial court helps dominate and dictate what policy will be. At other times, generals, loyal to the emperors Arcadius and Honorius, play this function. And at other moments, bishops intervene and they push the emperors to behave or act in different ways. And the tension between these groups is profound. But unlike previous moments in Roman history, these tensions and these groups, when they compete with each other, do not overthrow the emperors. Instead, they compete with each other to get privileged positions and access to the emperors. And so the emperors, these child emperors, serve effectively as figureheads who are never getting the full range of information and are always being kind of pushed or pulled by the people around them so that policies that they endorse support those interests. Now, these tensions between the court, the church, and the generals are really dangerous because they produce a great deal of chaos in the Roman state, both the Eastern state and the Western state. But this is particularly true in the West because of the unfortunate legacy that Theodosius left with his untimely death. So when Theodosius marched to the west to confront the usurper Eugenius, he left officials in charge in the east working effectively under the nominal authority of Arcadius. And when he went west, the most prominent figure he brought with him was a man named Stilicho, a half Vandal, half Roman general who was an important officer in Stilicho's army. And when Theodosius died, Honorius, who was at that point a young child, was still left in charge of the West, but Stilicho was made the regent who would govern the empire on his behalf. Now, as the regent of the Emperor of the West, Stilicho controlled, of course, the western half of the empire, which at that point was still intact. The dividing line between East and West was a bit problematic. For much of the 4th century, that line had actually run through basically what's now the eastern part of Greece. And so Bulgaria, Turkey, this would have been basically the beginning of the Eastern Empire. But during the civil war with Eugenius, Theodosius had taken control of that western territory in the Balkans and used it as a forward base to eventually invade Italy and overthrow Eugenius. And so the aftermath of that war meant that the Eastern court was effectively in control of that territory, really for the first time in a very long time, about a generation. And the effect of this was that Stilicho was in charge of the West, but Stilicho also felt that Theodosius had made him not just the regent in charge of Honorius's territory, but also the regent in charge of the East. And to press his claim of authority over the East, Stilicho initially wanted to retake control of this territory in the Balkans that had been historically Western territory, but had been shifted to the east as part of the civil war against Eugenius. And so Stilicho began developing policies that would allow him to take control of this territory and ultimately effectively take control of the Eastern Empire overall. But the court in the East resisted this, and they resisted this very strongly. And so to try to put pressure on the Eastern court and force the issue, Stilicho began working with a figure named Alaric. Now, Alaric was a Goth. He was descended from the people who had entered the Roman Empire in the 370s. He was part of the treaty that in 383 had regularized their status in Rome and brought them into the army. But he also was very sensitive to the fact that at the Battle of the Frigates, where Theodosius had won the civil war against Eugenius, Goths who had been brought into the Roman army following the peace treaty in 383 were forced to serve basically as cannon fodder. And large numbers of Goths died, and large numbers of Goths saw in this an effort by the Romans to use the war and to use the civil war and the deployment of Goths in this civil war as a way to basically extinguish the Gothic threat. And so Alaric rebelled. And his rebellion started in 395, and it started actually in Eastern territory. But Alaric also understood that this rebellion was a negotiating tactic. What he was looking to do was figure out a way to be integrated into the Roman structure again in a way that preserved the status and protected the rights and property of the people under his command. And so what Alaric was doing was basically attacking areas to sustain the rebellion while negotiating with imperial authorities. And Stilicho saw in this an effort to pressure the East and to use a kind of ally who was actively working against Roman control to basically buttress his own claims to territories in the Balkans and ultimately his claims to the Roman, to authority over both the East and the West. Now, Alaric and Stilicho begin working on an agreement to try to link up in 406, where Western forces and Alaric's forces will come together in the Balkans and wrest control of the Balkans away from the East and give this to the West. And this agreement was made, and Alaric was waiting on Stilicho's forces to come and meet him. But unfortunately, in 406, around New Year's Eve, a very, very severe cold snap happens. Now, the frontier that separated Rome from barbarian lands in the northwestern part of Europe was the Rhine River. And you can see here the Rhine River. In many places, the Rhine River has very, very steep banks on both sides. The river is deep. A lot of water flows through it. And so what you have here is a situation, and you can see here in a 13th century, 14th century castle, this was an area that could be fortified, and crossings could be prevented because it's very difficult to approach the banks of the river in many places. And once you approach the banks of the river, if you can get to the river, you still have to deal with Roman patrols that will prevent you from crossing it. But in 406, the river freezes solid, so much so that barbarian groups walk across and into Roman territory. And the Roman defensive structure was not meant to confront this. It assumed that barbarians who wanted to cross the Rhine would need a lot of boats to do this, and as they marshaled those boats, Roman forces could be prepared and could prevent them from crossing. But when the river freezes solid, people can cross in all kinds of different places. And a large group of people do cross. And the threat that these barbarians pose is really, really significant. Because it happens just at the time when Stilicho was planning to send troops into the Balkans to link up with Alaric and put pressure on the Western Empire. And, not coincidentally, there is also a rebellion by a Roman commander in the northwest of Europe, a Roman commander based in Gaul. And so Stilicho faces three significant threats at once. He faces the crossings of the Vandals and their allies over the frozen Rhine River, while also having an obligation to meet up with Alaric to pursue his dream of reunifying the Eastern and Western Empire under his authority as regent, and he has to deal with a rebellion in Gaul. And so Stilicho has to figure out what his priorities are. And what Stilicho decides to do is to confront the rebellion first, to leave the barbarian crossings to be dealt with later, and to basically not meet up with Alaric as planned. On one level, this makes a lot of sense. I mean, to deal with these issues, he withdraws troops from Britain, pulls them back into Gaul. He also stands Alaric up, and he tries to do his best to deal first with the rebellion, and then deal with the barbarian crossings, and then deal with Alaric. But Alaric has no interest in this. Remember that Alaric's goal throughout this entire rebellion that starts in the 390s is to negotiate a secure position for himself and his followers in the Roman state. And when Alaric senses that Stilicho is turning his back on an agreement that would do this, Alaric begins using violent tactics to start the negotiation again. And so he moves from the Balkans into northeastern Italy and begins attacking Italy and demands 4,000 pounds of gold from Stilicho to call off his attack. And so Stilicho goes to the Roman Senate and Roman nobility based in Italy. He raises the money. He gets them to agree to provide it for Alaric. But before the money can be delivered, on August 27th of 408, Stilicho is assassinated by disgruntled people in the court, and his main followers are killed as well. He's then replaced by an anti-Alaric faction at the court. And this has a number of different effects. Now, we can understand how this can happen. This is the usual shifting of the power bases underneath the figurehead Emperor Honorius. Stilicho, as a military figure, has been the dominant force in directing Western policy for the better part of a decade and a half. But now we see a shift, and the shift is that the court has managed to marshal resources to turn the emperor against Stilicho. But the knockoff effect is really significant, because this is on one level the same sort of internal conflict between different factions within the Roman state that we talked about in the last lecture. This is not in many ways dissimilar from what we saw in the 390s, with the shifting and the falling of Eutropius and the replacement of Eutropius with Chrysostom as an influential figure over popular opinion, and his replacement by another court official, or the challenges that Theodosius faces in dealing with barbarian commanders like Bouthericus and the clergy that has no interest in appealing to them. But the difference in 408 is that this shifting now takes place while the empire is confronting really significant external threats as well. There's the threat of Alaric. There's still the threat of the Vandals and others who crossed the Rhine River in 406. And so when the dynamic in the court shifts, this doesn't just change the way that internal Roman policy is functioning, it also changes foreign policy. And that's a really significant problem, because when Stilicho falls and the court adopts an anti-Alaric policy, Alaric is present. He's nearby. He has an army. He's in Italy. And the decision to purge the military of people loyal to Stilicho has the effect of getting a lot of those people loyal to Stilicho to decide to switch sides and join Alaric. And so the danger is not something that the people at the court really appreciated. They thought that this would unfold much like the shifting sands in the court politics and military politics of the 390s. But what actually happens here is threats are present that are so significant that these shifts are not just internal matters anymore. They're matters with really profound implications. And so the fall of Stilicho forces Alaric to take a relatively drastic step. When Alaric learns that Stilicho has fallen and that the party that was willing and able to negotiate agreements with Alaric has fallen and been expelled from government, Alaric then realizes that he needs to negotiate again to secure his position. And so Alaric sends an embassy to Honorius to make a peace treaty, but without any avail. And so when Honorius turns down Alaric, which again is completely understandable given the shifting of court priorities, and the people talking to Honorius are now anti-Alaric figures, Alaric then realizes that he needs to communicate to the emperor that he's a figure who actually needs to be respected. He actually does need to get some sort of security as he wishes from the emperor. And so he marches to Rome. And he attacks Rome, he lays siege to the city, and posts a large army of barbarians on the banks of the Tiber and prevents provisions coming into the city from the port. Now, after the siege had lasted some time and famine and pestilence begin to afflict the city, many of the slaves and most of the barbarians within the walls leave the city and desert to Alaric. And so Alaric tries to negotiate with Honorius in the way that he knows best and with the leverage that he has. He has an army, and so he marches on the city of Rome. Now, this is a problem for the empire more broadly, but it's not a problem for Honorius, because Stilicho, sensing that Rome was potentially too exposed, had moved the court out of the city of Rome and moved it to the city of Ravenna. And so you see the city of Ravenna is located basically just at the kind of elbow of the northeastern part of Italy. It's where the Po River empties, more or less, where the Po River empties into the Adriatic Sea. And Ravenna is surrounded by swamps on three sides, and the sea on the other side. So Ravenna is a very difficult place to attack. So when Alaric attacks the city of Rome, this is a city he can surround without a navy. And at the same time, though, Honorius is not particularly deeply personally affected by this because he's not in Rome. But the siege of Rome has the knockoff effect of increasing the number of people serving under Alaric, because a lot of slaves and barbarians who are in the city of Rome and are potentially concerned about the rise of an anti-barbarian faction in court see Alaric as an opportunity to better their lot. And so his army actually is reinforced by more people as they're besieging the city of Rome. And so Alaric represents a real threat to the city, but not to Honorius himself. And so the people who respond to this are not the people at the court, it's not Honorius, it's the senators, the people who actually live in the city of Rome. And so the senators, the inhabitants of the city, present many gifts to Alaric, and because of this he raises the siege when the Roman Senate agrees to persuade the emperor to enter into a peace treaty with him. And so Alaric lifts the siege because the senators have paid him to do this, and he trusts that if the Senate sends an embassy to the emperor will listen. And the emperor will give him the kind of official recognition and the security that Alaric wants. But instead, something different happens. Although the Senate sends ambassadors to the emperor, the enemies of Alaric at the court of the emperor guard against the conclusion of any peace treaty with him. And so, no peace treaty is reached. And so Alaric then arrives outside of the city of Rome, or the city of Ravenna, to try to put pressure on Honorius by going closer to the emperor, by underlining to him that the threat is real, it's significant, and something needs to be done. And so while Alaric is encamped outside of there, the emperor delegates negotiations to a man named Jovius. And the emperor gives Jovius the power to grant to Alaric as much money and provisions as he might desire, but he refuses to ever confer an imperial dignity, meaning an imperial position, that will give Alaric a permanence. And Jovius unadvisedly awaits the messenger from the palace in Alaric's camp. And when the messenger comes, Jovius commands the decision of the emperor to be read in the presence of all the barbarians. But on finding that a secure and permanent position of honor is denied to him, Alaric becomes enraged at the result and orders trumpets to be sounded and marches towards Rome. Now, what we have to understand here is this is a negotiation. And so the emperor communicates to Jovius that he can give Alaric money and provisions. He will basically be bought off. But Alaric is not looking for just money and provisions. He's looking for permanent security. And an imperial honor, the dignity that Alaric is asking for, that would give him this security. But Honorius's court does not want to give him this. And so when Honorius's court refuses to give him this, Alaric then makes a giant show of redeclaring hostilities to begin. And he marches off towards Rome. Now what Alaric is doing here is negotiating, right? You don't get what you want, and so you threaten to storm out of the negotiation. But Jovius is now freaking out, because Jovius feels like he overpromised, and the emperor is going to think that he has sided with Alaric. And so Jovius then immediately shifts ground. Now, Jovius's concern is that Stilicho, of course, was seen as siding too closely with Alaric, and he ended up being killed because a faction at the court didn't want him to be making those arrangements with Alaric. And so Jovius then freaks out and realizes that he has to make a show of the fact that he doesn't want to come to any terms with Alaric. And so this is what he does. He compels the officers around him to swear that they won't ever agree to any peace terms with Alaric. And this is, of course, an overreaction. What Alaric is doing is trying to make the peace terms better for himself. But the chaos at court and the unsettled situation where the emperor is not able to take a firm policy boxes Jovius in so that he now has to take an extreme position that is motivated by his own personal interests instead of the interests of the emperor. But Alaric makes it clear that he's actually still negotiating. After sounding the trumpets and saying that he's going to march on Rome, soon afterwards Alaric sends word that he actually isn't looking for an imperial honor, some sort of post of dignity, but he's willing instead to act as an ally of the Romans, provided that they grant him some territory, some food, and allow him to establish himself in that territory. What Alaric is basically doing now is walking back his demands. So initially he's making a demand that was almost equivalent to asking to be recognized as a figure with a level of authority almost like that of Stilicho. But now he's walked back to saying, give us the same sort of arrangement that you agreed to under Theodosius in 383. Give us some food to establish ourselves, some land on which to establish ourselves, and that will be enough for me. That will give me enough security that I am content to do this. But as we can see, Jovius has already said, I'm not going to make any agreement with Alaric because he feels like the court has stabbed him in the back. And he's very, very concerned about what will happen to him personally when the court has behaved this way. And so the chaos at the court sabotages any ability to reach an agreement that Alaric would be willing to tolerate. And so ultimately, this problem could have been resolved. What Alaric is asking for is something the Roman state had agreed to 25 years before. It's something the Roman state under a strong emperor would be capable of doing, and the problem could be resolved. But the weakness of the emperor and the sort of shifting sands and the chaotic arrangements at court mean that the people the emperor has delegated to make arrangements with Alaric are not capable of actually doing this. They don't trust that they will be protected if they come to terms with Alaric. And so the negotiations fall apart again. And so Alaric then returns to Rome. And first he'd sent ambassadors to try to come up with some agreement when Jovius could not, but without any sort of effect. So Alaric returns to Rome and besieges the city. This is in 409. He takes possession of one part of the port, and then he compels the Romans to recognize Priscus Attalus, then the prefect of the city, as their emperor. Now this is a very interesting situation because now it's 409. It's a year after Alaric first moved on Rome. It's a year after the Roman Senate had negotiated with Alaric to try to come to an arrangement that would settle the situation down. And now it seems that when Alaric returns to Rome, the Roman Senate advanced an alternative emperor because Honorius was not looking out for the city. So Attalus is not chosen by Alaric. Attalus leads a rebellion that's backed by the Senate, a Senate that has no willingness to entrust the city's fate to Honorius because they do not trust Honorius. And so Attalus then is elevated by the Senate, and the presence of Alaric's forces compel anybody in the city who doesn't want to recognize Attalus as emperor to do so. And so now there are two emperors in Italy, Attalus, who's backed by the Senate and backed by Alaric, and Honorius, who's backed by the court and based in the city of Ravenna. And Attalus then starts a campaign to take the Western Empire from Honorius. And so he arranges to send troops to Africa to try to depose the governor of that province, the province that provides a lot of the food supply to the city of Rome and Italy. And he marches with Alaric's army to try to get as far as Ravenna and completely destroy the regime of Honorius. And when it's announced that Attalus had reached the city of Arminum with an army composed partly of Roman and partly of barbarian troops, Honorius wrote to him to acknowledge him as emperor and deputed to him the highest honors of his court and offer him a share in the empire. But Attalus at this point refused to share power with another and sent word that Honorius might choose an island or any spot of ground that he pleased for private residence, and he would there be allowed every imperial service. And so as the army of Attalus and Alaric advances on Ravenna, what we see is something very interesting. This is not Alaric's army. This is Alaric's army and Attalus's army. And what Attalus has extended to Alaric is the sort of rank and position that Alaric had been asking for all along. And in exchange, Alaric will work with him. So what we have is an emperor elevated by the Senate who has, in essence, agreed to have Alaric function in a capacity much like what Alaric had been demanding of Honorius. And Honorius recognizes that his situation is very dire. He not only does not have the military forces at his disposal to deal with the approach of a Roman and barbarian army, a combined Roman and barbarian army, but he doesn't even trust the troops who are present. He doesn't trust the Italians manning Ravenna because they know that he has governed in such an incompetent fashion that in essence they might be better off with the regime of Attalus and Alaric. And so the condition of Honorius is reduced to such a critical state that ships were kept in readiness to convey him to Constantinople, to the court of his nephew Theodosius II, who had just taken over after the death of his father Arcadius. But an army of 4,000 men, which had started from the east, I should say, arrived unexpectedly during the night at Ravenna. And Honorius caused the walls of the city to be guarded by this reinforcement, for he distrusted the native troops as inclined to treachery. And so what we see is Honorius' regime was about to fall. But he's reinforced by troops that seem to have been sent by the court in Constantinople. And this buttresses his spirit, because those troops are trustworthy. The troops that he actually has are not trustworthy, because they can see how incompetent he is. But the troops that have come from or been sent by Theodosius are loyal troops. They are not Western troops, and they are invested in supporting Honorius because this is what their commander, the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius, had ordered them to do. But while this was happening, the campaign in North Africa was going very badly, and Attalus then made a very foolish decision. Although Attalus is working with this combined structure of Roman and barbarian troops, and Alaric has become his effective military commander in charge of all of the campaigns that are being mounted by the regime, Attalus refuses to listen to Alaric's advice about how to deal with the situation in North Africa. And so, as the Roman troops sent by Attalus fail to take the province, Alaric advises that 500 barbarians should be sent into Africa against Heraclian, the governor. But the senators and Attalus objected that Africa should not be entrusted to barbarians. And it then became evident to Alaric that God disapproved of the reign of Attalus. And finding that it would be futile to labor for a matter which was beyond his power, and after receiving certain pledges, he agreed with Honorius to deprive Attalus of his sovereignty. So it's important to see what happens here. Alaric had made an arrangement with Attalus that he thought was a trustworthy arrangement, where Attalus would be running the empire, and Alaric would be, in essence, his first in command of the military. But when Alaric advises that the campaign in Africa requires reinforcements using barbarians under Alaric's supervision, Attalus in the Senate says no. They said that basically they don't trust barbarians to go to Africa because they don't trust that those barbarians won't just take Africa from the empire. And it then becomes clear to Alaric that his position is not stable, that Attalus is not actually observing the guarantees and the position that he promised to Alaric, and that therefore negotiations can resume. God disapproved of the rule of Attalus. Well, this is a way of Alaric saying, it is now obvious that Attalus is not a man of his word. And so Alaric then opens negotiations with Honorius to try to get a better guarantee, a more firm guarantee. And Honorius agrees to do this. And so Alaric switches sides. And he believes that Honorius is going to be a man of his word, now that Alaric has switched sides and is now supporting Honorius. But it seems that Honorius was actually just using this as a ruse to remove support from Attalus, and then, once Attalus was no longer a factor, turn on Alaric again. Because Alaric then, while the honors are being worked out from Honorius, holds a conference with figures loyal to Honorius to try to work out how this would work. And following this conference, troops loyal to Honorius then attack Alaric and try to assassinate him. Now, it's not clear if Honorius ordered this or if this was a sort of spontaneous thing, but this was the last straw for Alaric. Alaric then retraces his steps and returns to Rome, impelled by rage and terror at the attempted assassination. And then he takes the city by treachery. We're told the gates were actually opened for him. And Alaric then permits each of his followers to seize as much of the wealth as he was able and to plunder all of the houses in the city. This is on August 24th of 410. And of course, it looked just like this. Now, if we pause for a moment to think about what actually happened here, the rage and terror is certainly real. Alaric has been negotiating with the court in Ravenna and negotiating with the court of Honorius in 410. He's been doing this for more than 2 years since the fall of Stilicho. And at each point, the court has been unreliable. They have made promises they don't uphold. They have hinted at arrangements that they actually, in the end, are not willing to make. And Alaric is angry. And so the attack on Rome is something that is a result of that anger. But it's also a result of his genuine fear that as these negotiations keep spinning in circles, there is always the threat that he and his people will die. That whenever their situation deteriorates to such a point that Honorius and his forces might be able to take advantage of the weakness, they will be killed. Because Honorius does not respect them and does not want them to survive. And so this is a story that for Alaric began with the Battle of the Frigates in 394, when Theodosius, in Alaric's view, sent Gothic troops to be slaughtered en masse in a campaign where the Gothic troops were fighting for him. And this is a pattern that Alaric sees over and over again in Stilicho's betrayal, in Honorius's repeated failures to abide by his word, in the negotiations that were taking place in Alaric's view, disingenuously. There is rage and there is terror, and the sack of Rome is something that evolves out of this. Now, for Honorius, it's also clear why Honorius as an individual would be making these choices. Honorius is a young person. He does not have the full information, and he trusts the information that's coming to him through his courtiers. And his courtiers are anti-Alaric. This goes all the way back to the assassination of Stilicho. And so Honorius is not getting good advice. And because Honorius is in the city of Ravenna, Rome is a secondary concern. It's a theoretical concern. Honorius doesn't live there. Honorius is not particularly affected by it. And Honorius does not have very strong relationships with the Senate or even with the Bishop of Rome. They do not have ready access to him. Their access to him is filtered through courtiers who are anti-Alaric and are much more interested in opposing Alaric than they are in supporting the city of Rome. And so the sack of Rome is something that was avoidable. In a different situation, with a stronger emperor who was better able to recognize the situation and compromise with Alaric, Rome would not have been sacked in 410. If Attalus and the Senate had behaved in a more forthright way, Rome would not have been sacked in 410. There are a lot of different ways that Rome could have escaped this sack. But this sack, when it happened, since it happened, because it happened, profoundly changes the way Romans think about their empire and think about their present reality. Because the sack of Rome was the first such incident in 800 years. The last time barbarians had been in the city of Rome and had sacked the city was in 390 BC, when Gauls sacked the city under Brennus. It was seen as inconceivable that the city of Rome would be sacked again. This was something Romans didn't know how to process. And so because Rome was sacked, Romans, once they get over the shock when they hear about this, begin a process of trying to figure out who is responsible for this. And one of the things that is immediately centered on is Christianity. The fact that the empire had turned away from traditional religion. The fact that, as Symmachus had laid out 25 years before, traditional religion had protected the city. And who is so favorable and friendly to barbarians that they could turn away from it? Symmachus had warned Romans about this. And so traditions evolve, especially pagan traditions among pagan Romans, that say that this was caused not so much by the incompetence of the emperor, but it was caused by impiety. And so while Alaric is besieging the city, a Christian source writing in Constantinople tells us that those among the senators who still adhered to pagan belief proposed to offer sacrifices in the capital and the other temples. And certain Tuscans, who were summoned by the prefect of the city, promised to drive out the barbarians with thunder and lightning. And they boasted of having performed a similar exploit at the city of Larnia, a city in Tuscany, when Alaric had passed by for Rome and had not taken the city. And all people of good sense, though, were aware that the calamities which the siege entailed upon the Romans were indications of divine wrath sent to chastise them for their luxury, debauchery, and manifold acts of injustice towards each other as well as towards strangers. And so pagans said that the reason Rome was sacked was because Rome had turned away from traditional religion, and when traditional sacrifices were proposed as a way to block Alaric's advance, this was not allowed to happen. But, this Christian source says, all Christians understood that it wasn't about paganism, it was about them being too devoted to luxury and being debauched, and therefore it had nothing to do with paganism. It had to do with the bad, vicious behavior of Romans, and therefore Rome was sacked because Romans were bad people. Now, what Sozomen is trying to refute is a very strong and powerful argument that pagans make. Pagan sources, like the history written by Zosimus about 100 years later, says that actually the sack of Rome was very clearly brought about by the actions, the negative actions, and the negative actions that the state took to turn away from traditional religion. And this is a very compelling argument, because after ruling the same territory for more than 300 years, a few decades after Rome converted to Christianity, the state basically was on the verge of falling apart. The capital was sacked, and because of this, one can say there's a clear causal relationship. And this is something that Christians needed to respond to, and they struggled to do this. We see in the aftermath of 410, St. Augustine preaches sermons in North Africa, where he says if pagans bring up stuff like what Zosimus is saying, or stuff like what Sozomen has said, basically change the subject. We don't really have a good response. Just say that that's not true and move on, because there's not really an effective way that I can give you that can refute this really powerful response. But Augustine starts framing something like that. He starts framing something like that in the City of God. And the City of God will ultimately offer the detailed, philosophically motivated, and theologically sophisticated response to the sack of Rome. In essence, it will say that the temporal state of the Roman Empire is not important. It's an agent that can help advance God's cause, but God's cause can also be advanced without that state. And as a Christian, what you need to do is focus on your membership in the community of Christians, not your membership in the community of Romans. And if you are a good Christian who belongs in good stead to the community of Christians, it shouldn't matter to you what happens to the empire. But it took Augustine a long time to frame so sophisticated a response. In the meantime, Augustine has an associate named Orosius. He has him write a history that's designed to explain that yes, the sack of Rome happened, but it's not really so bad. And so Orosius' history against the pagans is in essence a response to the idea that the sack of Rome changes everything. What Orosius says is the sack of Rome changes nothing. Less damage was caused by the sack of Rome than by the fire that occurred in the city of Rome under the Emperor Nero in 64. Orosius says the sack of Rome only lasted for 3 days, and much bigger and more severe disasters afflicted Rome in the past, and so we shouldn't actually take this very seriously. But the sack of Rome was just the first in a long series of devastating reverses that hit Rome across the 5th century. And this is why, by the time the City of God appears, nearly 10 years after Orosius' response, it has to take this tack that says, even if the empire falls, it doesn't matter to a Christian who belongs to a community of Christians. The empire is a secondary concern to Christians. No one in the 410s thought the empire would fall. No one in the 410s thought that the empire would be threatened by the sorts of stuff that Augustine has to acknowledge as real possibilities in the 420s. But as we move from the 420s into the 430s, what we see is Rome is starting to lose control of significant territories in the west. Britain was abandoned in 406. Much of southwestern Gaul is lost to the people who served and fought under Alaric. They're given control of this territory in 418. Spain and ultimately North Africa is lost to the Vandals and people who had crossed in 406. And people who live in Roman territory and expected to spend their entire life living in Roman territory suddenly don't. People whose families had been Roman for 400 years suddenly are Romans living under the control of someone who is not Roman. And this brings us into the world of Paulinus Pella. Now, Paulinus of Pella is an incredibly interesting figure for this sort of transformation, because Paulinus of Pella is the grandson of a wealthy senator who served as one of the main advisors to the Emperor Gratian in the 370s and early 380s. His family is extremely wealthy, and Paulinus grows up as a young man enjoying the wealth of the Roman Empire of the late 380s and early 390s. A Roman Empire that's secure in its territory, and a Roman Empire that extends across all of the Mediterranean and allows people with wealth to own property everywhere and travel between that property just as they would want. It's in when Paulinus is a young man, he talks about how great it would be if the life that he had as a young man continued, and the former times of peace that made this possible. But by the time Paulinus is in his 20s, the army of Alaric has moved through Italy, and Paulinus hides out in Greece to escape the attacks of them. But ultimately, Alaric dies, and Gothic forces, as they're moving through the countryside, under the successor of Alaric, move to the estates where Paulinus is. Now, Paulinus is induced to come back to those estates, and he ultimately agrees to serve as somebody who will try to raise money to support the Gothic troops and support the puppet regime that they have set up. And it doesn't work out. And so because of this, because Paulinus made promises to pay money that he didn't have and he couldn't raise the money, his house was given up to be pillaged by the retiring horde. And we were driven from our ancestral home straight away. And then a siege of the enemy overtook us in the neighboring city, which was also my forefathers' native place. And far more dangerous than a beleaguering foe, a conspiracy of slaves abandoned through free estate armed themselves for the slaughter of the gentry. And so as Gothic forces moved through the countryside, all of the structures that had supported the economic and social life that Paulinus had become accustomed to, they fall apart. And with it, Paulinus's wealth, his position, and his prosperity also falls apart. And so Paulinus loses his property. He loses his rank. And ultimately, he ends up being left poor and alone in a small house in Marseille. So someone who belonged to the very top of the Roman social and economic structure sees himself reduced entirely to position of basically not penury, but definitely not a position of prominence or wealth. And so how would one react to this? Someone whose position, comfort, and luxury was guaranteed by a Roman state that no longer exists, and who loses not only all of those wonderful things that made his life comfortable, but also loses the protection of being Roman under a Roman regime. What Paulinus says is something that's quite remarkable. He says that all of these losses, I believe, were ordained by Christ for the purpose of strengthening my faith. And as I suppose that by the prolonged experience I might gradually find out how far your favor could avail me, when though deprived of means through countless losses, I still saw that there was always a house available to me, and my means were replenished by your providence. And so Paulinus's message here is very clear. Paulinus speaks about the collapse of his fortune, the loss of his property, and the reduction of his status as something that's a good thing. Augustine had talked about how in the aftermath of the decline of the Roman political order and economic order in the West, Christians could turn to something else. They could turn to what really mattered, which was their participation in a Christian community. What Paulinus says is something that's even stronger. He's not only saying that I find meaning in being part of a Christian community, he's saying that these losses were necessary for me to become the best Christian possible. And so when we look at this, what we see is Paulinus has a narrative of Roman decline. It's a profound narrative of Roman decline. It's a powerful narrative of Roman decline. It's a narrative of decline that talks about someone who enjoyed the best the empire had to offer and saw all of that go away. And that's a material decline, it's a political decline, it's even a territorial decline, as he's no longer living in a Roman state. But for Paulinus, all of these declines are actually good. For Paulinus, the experience of losing all of these things allowed him to make progress in what matters most. And what matters most to Paulinus is that he is a better Christian. Paulinus acknowledges entirely and wholeheartedly that conditions in the West have declined, that his personal conditions, his wealth, his prominence, his position, even his membership in a community of fellow citizens. These things have all collapsed, and yet he's happy because Paulinus sees himself as a kind of modern day Job. All of these things were tests that God put forward to make Paulinus a better Christian. And these things did make Paulinus a better Christian. Paulinus feels quite strongly that because these things happened, he is in a better place. And so a narrative that in many ways people might embrace as a narrative of decline, to Paulinus is nothing of the sort. To Paulinus, this is progress. This makes his condition better, and it makes the condition of other Christians better. And this is a very real sentiment. It's something that might seem strange to us in a modern context, but Paulinus is not the only one saying these things. Many people in the West who have the luxury to reflect on their condition see similar things to what Paulinus sees. The recession of Roman power and Roman prosperity means the progress of a better Christian future. And so when we think about narratives of decline and narratives of progress, we have to understand that these things are relative and are reflections of the conditions and ideas and values of the people who lived through them. And what Paulinus shows is even the clearest narrative of material decline might actually be reshaped and understood in a new fashion as a narrative of progress.